Thank you very much for having me. First time in Serbia. It's beautiful and amazing, and I don't know why it took me so long to get here, but thanks for having me. Quick PSA, because a lot of people maybe after this talk are going to be looking to find some way to connect with me. So I'm known as Getify everywhere except on Twitter. I haven't used Twitter in like 2 years because people are such assholes to each other there, so I don't know why people still keep following that account. I have it, but it's been inactive for 2 years, and still people follow it. So stop following that account because I'm not using it anymore. So I have some thoughts that I want to share with you today. It's confessions from an imposter. And immediately you might be thinking, does that guy play Among Us? And the answer is no. My kids do, but I definitely have never mastered this particular game. I'm talking about a different kind of imposter. Now, to get this out of the way, there is definitely a negative connotation around the idea of imposter. And I pulled out this definition from the dictionary because it's someone who practices deception. They are intentionally trying to deceive people or convince people that they are somebody who they are not. That is not what we mean when we talk about imposter syndrome. We're not talking about someone with malintent. We're not talking about someone who makes their literal career out of trying to deceive other people and pretend to do jobs that they have absolutely no qualification for doing. But that is what imposter syndrome seems to do to us, because it is this psychological trick that our brains play on us. Now, I want to, just by a show of hands, how many of you here have felt at some point in your career, maybe even presently at this conference, some aspect of feeling this imposter syndrome? By a show of hands. Look around you. There's a lot of hands going up. There are a lot of hands that didn't go up, and I wonder if a few of you are like me. Maybe you didn't put your hand up because you feel imposter syndrome about your imposter syndrome. Anyone like that? I definitely felt like I'm not even qualified to talk about this. So a few disclaimers before we get into what my thoughts on imposter syndrome. Number one, I am not a doctor nor a psychologist. This is a real, actual studied thing that experts in the fields have studied, and they have looked at the impacts that people have from this imposter syndrome. And so I don't want you to hear anything in my talk as trying to negate or disagree with the experts who know what they're talking about. Okay, I'm trying to add to the conversation. I'm not trying to play a doctor or a psychologist on TV. Number two, I will say that this disproportionately affects people from traditionally underrepresented groups. And there are many of those underrepresented groups represented here in this room today. And I want to say that even though I absolutely have felt imposter syndrome and presently still feel imposter syndrome from time to time, I cannot possibly have the same lived experience as some of you. And I don't mean in any way to demean or to diminish the effects, the real lived experiences that you may have had with this. So please don't hear me to be saying that. If you have struggled with this, I'm hoping that today's talk will give you a different perspective on it, but I don't mean to disagree with any of your experience. And thirdly, I will say that there are many, many people that have said much more helpful and articulate things on this topic. I did a lot of research in preparation for this talk, and one of them that I found was by this fantastic author and speaker named Louise Curtis. And I absolutely want you to go and read this blog post and watch the TEDx talk. This, you know how people share links and then nobody ever does it? I really actually do want you to. This is a fantastic talk, and I just wanted to briefly summarize it, but I'm not going to do it justice. Louise coins this idea called concert imposter syndrome. It's like if you're at a concert and you're in the front row, you're singing along to your favorite band's lyrics, and then you look to the left or right of you and you realize that somebody else knows a little bit more of the lyrics than you do. And all of a sudden you start doubting, like, I'm not a true fan, I'm not good enough because the person here knows more of the lyrics. And as we would kind of nod and smile and think that that's a silly way of thinking, that's the sort of thing that happens to us in our careers. The thing I want to point out about that definition of imposter syndrome is that it's a psychological trick. It is taking what your actual skills and talents are, and your brain is trying to diminish them and say, those are not good enough. That's not at all the same thing as you trying to make up skills and talents that you don't possess. It's diminishing the skills and talents that you actually have lower than they ought to be considered. A couple of quotes I wanted to pull out from Louise's blog post. When I feel imposter syndrome, start to bite. I know this means I'm passionate about something and that I'm surrounded by the right people to help me improve. If you're feeling like an imposter, you're probably in the best possible position to learn and grow. All you need to do is embrace the experience. I absolutely love the spirit of this. It's such a great and positive way of thinking about this imposter syndrome. Not as this thing that is oppressing us and holding us back, but as something that is giving us new and interesting opportunities that we might not have otherwise recognized. And so, with so many great things having been said about this topic, I actually had the imposter syndrome of like, maybe I don't even have much else to say better than what others have said on this topic. And so you might be wondering, well, is that it? Are we about done? He showed us that blog post and then we're done. It's a great post and a great talk, and I encourage you to go and read and watch that. But I do have some other thoughts. I'm going to go in a slightly different direction with it. As I said, what I'd like to do is reframe this concept of impostorism from being a negative thing to being a positive thing. What I want us to do is figure out, is there a way for us to be proud of being an imposter? Could we actually have impostorism as a part of our professional identity, something that we are proud to show off and that we strive to improve at? That might sound contradictory to you, but I want to pull up a couple of I'm pulled out the thesaurus and a couple of synonyms for this word imposter, and I weeded out all the ones that are automatically negative. And I've pulled out a few that don't necessarily have a negative connotation attached to them. You've probably heard the word actor and the word imitator, and you've probably never thought of those in a negative light, or at least not generally in a negative light. Like, we don't think that an actor or an imitator is doing something evil against us, like they're trying to pull one over on us. We think that they're entertaining us, or they're giving us interesting, different perspectives or information. That's also being an imposter, and that's kind of hinting towards the positive aspects that maybe go underserved with this imposter idea. But I want to focus specifically on this third one, empiric. Not a word that is used in common everyday conversation. It's an archaic word that would have been used 100 years ago or more. But you will probably recognize it as the root of the word empirical, meaning to be evidence-based. So what is an empiric? An empiric is a person who relies solely on practical experience rather than on scientific principle. Now, this was coined originally as more of a negative thing, because there were people who were going around and they were charlatans and they were pretending as if they could cure people's diseases and do certain kinds of things, and they had no medical or scientific skill whatsoever, and they were pulling tricks over on people. And I do not mean that in any way. But again, as with both things, as I've said several times now, I think that there's another side that we could be looking at in empiric. And maybe we could actually strive to want to be a little bit more like the empiric. Because an empiric also was unwilling to be held back by the fact that they had not been given the credentials by the world around them and been deemed an expert before they could go out and start to try to observe what's happening in the world and explain what they're seeing through their observation. That's what empirical evidence is that we observe actual things. Whether we can explain them or not, we can say, I saw this happen because I observed it to occur. So we might say that an empiric is a positive sense of being an imposter, because an empiric says, what I can do is far more important than what people have credentialed my knowledge and skill to be. What I am able to observe and what I am able to do in the world maybe has more importance than the degree that I have hanging on the wall. Let me talk about it this way. I get this, I've already had this a couple of times today, and I get this quite regularly. Someone will come up to me and they'll say something like, I'm working on this thing, and they fill in the blank with like it's a blog post, or it's a project, an open source project, or a conference talk, or a meetup talk, or a book, some other kind of project, and they say, I'm working on this thing, but it's not quite ready yet for me to show off to other people. And I won't make you put up your hands, but I imagine that many of you in this room have felt that and maybe even presently feel that right now. Maybe there's something that you've been working on for a while, but you haven't figured out how to get quite enough confidence to show this off to other people. And I want to share with you exactly what I share when other people ask me this exact question. This is how I respond. If you wait until you consider yourself to be an expert, you waited too long. Now, why do I say that? It's because as human beings, this has nothing to do with your job title as an engineer. As human beings, We are fundamentally relational creatures, and we fundamentally prefer to have the connections with other human beings. That's how we're wired, which means that we are much more interested in the journey than in the destination. If you ever think back to any of the times that you have been most motivated in your life, I bet that you would say that the things that motivated you the most are the things that you could relate to the closest, and you could imagine yourself being part of that same journey and doing the same thing as the person who was motivating you. It was not when somebody stood up and said, "I am amazing, I am awesome, look at all of my credentials." I didn't start this talk by listing off all of my experiences or all of the things that I've achieved in my career, and I am blessed beyond measure to have had such an outsized impact. So many of you have said that you've appreciated the things that I've been able to do, and I never imagined that I could have been able to do that. But I didn't stand up here sharing these thoughts based upon those credentials. I'm just up here as another person just like you who struggles with these exact same things and is looking for some way to trick my brain into being back into a more productive mode. I've got a bit of a silly illustration for this. And hopefully they're going to be able to switch over the camera so that you can see this a little bit easier for those of you that are there in the back. I do my own laundry, and invariably, no matter how I put my shirts in the laundry, they always come out of the laundry inside out. So here is what I'm always doing, is I'm always having to invert my shirt. So I just grab the shirt and pull it through and then straighten it out, just like that. And this one says wrong way. I'm not sure if there is a right or a wrong way to invert a t-shirt, though. Is there? I mean, the truth is I pulled it through, I don't even know if this is what it's called because I'm not a garment expert, but I pulled it through the top neck hole, right, the neck opening. But I could also pull it through the sleeve. Watch that. I can pull the entire shirt through the sleeve and also end up inverting it. Now, it might be a little bit extra effort for me to have inverted it that way, but it still accomplished the task. And some of you are saying, what a silly guy. Why isn't he just using the big opening at the bottom to invert it? It's so much easier to pull the shirt through the big opening at the bottom, right? So 3 different ways of doing this same task. And is it really true that there's a right or a wrong way to do that? You know, it turns out there's actually, and I found this sort of fascinating, there's actually math behind the ability to invert a garment through its holes like that. All these math terms that I Googled, and I have no idea what any of those terms mean. If you're expecting a mathematical explanation, you came to the wrong source. I don't know. But the point is that I'm able to invert my shirts and get my laundry done. Even if I'm not doing it in the expert and most, the best possible way, the most efficient way, I'm still able to get the job done. And I think that that is true in many more areas of our life. So maybe being an expert at something is not the thing to strive for. Maybe there's another thing for us to be striving for. Sometimes just doing is actually the best way to learn. This pragmatic and empirical way of looking at the things around you, looking at the skills that you'd like to do. Going back to the earliest parts of the web, and I remember when I was learning, you know how we learned? We did view source. And we just saw how somebody else did it, and then we copied and pasted and messed around with a few things, and boom, we had a website going that had the fancy mouse cursor trails or, you know, the marquee or whatever. Now, I've spent my entire career encouraging people to learn their tools more deeply, and I am not contradicting that in any way. It is preferable for you to eventually understand how what you're doing works. So you don't shortcut and never do the learning. But maybe you don't have to wait for that learning just to get started. Maybe getting started is actually the best step in that learning journey. Now, I'm going to give you a very fancy chart, okay? So get ready for this. Here's a fancy chart. It's a little bit complicated to follow. If you start by doing, that will lead to learning, and then learning will lead to doing. And that's it. That's the entire scientific basis for this talk. That there's a cycle, and a lot of us think that we have to start at the learning cycle and get certified and be considered an expert before we ever publicly do. And I'm suggesting let's start at the other part of the cycle, and let's publicly do, and then let that lead to more learning. And in fact, I'm suggesting that not only is that a good idea, that's essential to us getting our jobs done. Your boss is not going to wait around for you to become an expert on React. There aren't that many. There's a lot of people that know React very well. There aren't that many people that are literally experts on that technology, and yet you're still going to need to be paid to do. So remember I said that I wanted to redefine, I wanted to come up with a different way of talking, a role and an identity for us to go after this impostorism, a professional imposter. Here's how I would describe a professional imposter: someone who's passionate enough to do early and often, and they're always patiently evolving their observed experience into expertise, and they're always curious and willing to ask how and even why. This is what I hope they put on my gravestone someday. It's what I want people to say about me, that I lived my life trying to do and make the world better, and I let the learning come along for the ride, instead of waiting around until I had accumulated all of the credentials, and then I could stand up on an ivory tower and talk down at everyone about how great I am at something. The books that you've probably read, the You Don't Know JS books, those were not written from the perspective of somebody who had already mastered the language. Those were written from the perspective of someone who'd been rejected by job interviews because he didn't know enough JavaScript. Okay? Now, if this idea of this identity of being an imposter, if this is something that you can identify with, I've launched a campaign recently called the Professional Imposter Manifesto. It's up on impostor.ly, and I know that might seem a little bit silly, but I strongly encourage you, go to that website, read about the Professional Imposter Manifesto, and if it resonates with you, click to sign it. And then share it with somebody else, because I guarantee you, everyone in this room, you know somebody who also struggles with this, and you know someone who might benefit from us untricking our brains, or rather re-tricking our brains into thinking about impostorism as a positive thing to strive towards, rather than a negative thing that holds us back. Now, many of you might rightly ask, why use the word imposter? Why not just pick a different word? A word like amateur or journeyman or something like that. And those are good words, those are fine words. But what I know a little bit from Googling about our neuroscience is that's not going to do the trick. We're not going to be able to convince our brains that impostorism is a good thing if we use another term. We're always going to be plagued by the imposter syndrome. So what I'm attempting to do is trick our brains into saying, wait a minute, if I start to feel like an imposter, that's a good thing, and I should lean into that. I should run towards that instead of being scared and held back by it. Now, I've been talking for quite a while, and you've been wondering, when's he going to get to the confessions? So it's time for some confessions. I'm going to go through all of the different core disciplines of our industry, of the web building industry, and I'm going to show you why in each one of these areas, I'm an imposter. And some of you are going to disagree or not believe me, but I absolutely 100% believe this. Let's start with web design, okay? Now, I'm about to give you a content warning, okay? Because the next slide that I'm about to show is going to hurt your eyes. It might burn your eyes a little bit. So just, if you have sensitive visual system, just be careful. I went back into archive.org and found the first 2 websites that I ever designed and built back in like 2000. And it's stunning to me that, first of all, that there's still evidence of these crimes against humanity, but also that somebody paid me to do that work. I don't know what they were thinking, okay? Clearly, design skill is not my forte. You might find it strange to hear that I actually have an art background. I did a whole bunch of art, and I won awards in art shows. It didn't translate to the computer. I couldn't translate any of my painting skills to being able to do stuff that looked nice on the computer. Now, there's a whole bunch of other examples that I can embarrass myself with, but for time, I'm going to skip forward to a couple of projects that I've recently done. And maybe I've gotten slightly better at the design, but I think we can all agree this is still not my strong suit, and I probably should have somebody else doing better design for me. Here's a couple of apps that I've recently built. On the left here, you see this Flash math cards. This is an app I built for my kids for them to practice math. You like slide through the cards just like memory cards, and it's got the addition and subtraction and stuff. If you have kids and you wanted to practice their math, you can go and use that completely for free. It's an installable web app. On the right is a game that I wrote. Anybody in here play word games like Wordle, stuff like that? Okay, quite a few of you. Wordscapes and other ones. I like word games. I just don't like games where there's a healthy mix of luck involved, like if you just have a lucky guess. So I came up with a game concept that I've named Dwordly. It's based on the concepts of Wordle, but it's a bit different. You start out with a single longer word, and you have to make one change to a letter at a time, either removing or flipping a letter, and then work your way, by making real words, work your way all the way down to a single letter word like A or I. That's a basic premise of the game. The point I wanted to make is that I had these ideas for things that I wanted to create, but clearly I'm not a particularly talented designer, and yet I did not allow my lack of design skill from preventing me from getting some ideas out there and being useful. My kids have practiced this and shared it with their classmates. The teachers have used it. I've played Dwordly. I've had a couple of dozen other people tell me that they play it on a daily basis. I was able to get some ideas out there even if I wasn't an expert at design. Clearly, I'm an imposter at this. All right, let's move on to HTML, another one of our core technologies. I want to show you a snippet of HTML that I wrote not only a couple of months ago, and I wrote this because I needed to create a little survey site for my Kickstarter backers last fall. What I want to point out here is that I'm not using any fancy web components, custom elements, any of that Shadow DOM stuff. I'm using the plain old boring paragraph tags and span tags. And there's no fancy JSX or anything that's building this markup together. I just wrote some basic HTML, and it was just enough to get the job done. And this represents the most sophisticated HTML that I'm capable of writing. It's not like I intentionally chose to simplify it. This is the best that I've got because I am not an expert at HTML. I understand something about semantic tags, and we've seen talks here earlier already about a variety of other reasons why it's important to understand all these semantic tags. And I try to pick the best tag for a particular purpose, whether it's strong or some of these other kinds of semantic tags. I try to pick those, but this is the best that I've got. Here's that math cards app that I was talking about. I just want to show you the markup for the 7 + 1 =? That part of the design of that, this is it. That's as sophisticated as I get. I used a little bit of CSS, which I'll talk about in a minute, to try to make that look a little bit better, but it's just some divs and some spans. No fancy custom elements or anything. That game, the Dwordly game, I have a light mode, dark mode selector in it. And what I wanted with this light mode, dark mode selector, this was the design aesthetic that I was going for. What I wanted was a toggle, kind of like what you see here, but the semantic that I wanted underneath the covers, the HTML that I wanted, was radio buttons, 2 radio buttons. And all of the examples of toggle buttons that look like this, they're all marked up with checkboxes, at least as far as I could Google and find. And that's not the right semantic, because this is not an on-off situation. It's an affirmative selection between 2 options. So I think it makes more sense to be done as a radio button, but I couldn't find any example of people doing it. Maybe they're out there. I just couldn't find any examples of that, so I had to just figure something out. So here's the markup I used, and it's real simple and stupid. I put a couple of divs together, radio buttons on either side, and then a div that I hide underneath it for the track behind it. And again, I'll show you in a moment the CSS of how I made that look like a toggle selector. There's probably way better ways of doing this. But I don't know them because I'm an imposter at this stuff. I've mentioned CSS. Let's get into that. So let's talk about that light mode, dark mode selector. How am I marking up the radio buttons to look like this? Well, to start with, what I have is the selector itself, the track behind the selector. You notice there I just have a z-index -1. There's probably way better ways of doing that, but that's the only way I could figure out how to make sure that it hid itself behind the 2 buttons. And I've just got both of the input radio, I've got them set to visibility hidden. And then I'm going to show the little, thumb thing, the little orange or black thumb thing on top of those with pseudo elements. So here I've got a couple of pseudo elements, the after and before, and I'm making those by default hidden. And then down here at the bottom, you just notice I'm seeing which one of the radio buttons is checked and making the appropriate pseudo element visible. Again, there's probably way better and more creative and more maintainable and more abstracted ways of doing this. I just don't know how to do that because I'm not very good at CSS. I'm just good enough to try to get something kind of laid out. Let's talk about the selectors, and specifically, let's talk about colors. Here's another area that I'm an imposter at, because I just naively assumed that if you were doing light mode and dark mode, all you need to do was just reverse the light and the dark colors. Turns out it's way more complicated than that. Here's the light colors that I was using, and when I flipped it around, it was barely readable. It looked terrible. And so it turns out that with the dark mode, when you flip on, you need to do slightly different kinds of colors, because there's a whole bunch of complex science behind the way that things look, and it's not as easy as just flipping the things around. Light on dark is not at all the same thing as dark on light. So I just fiddled around until I found some colors that worked. That's the most scientific process that I've got. Let's also continue on this topic of colors. There were several places in the code where I wanted to be able to define a single color, and then I wanted to programmatically, in my CSS, define different opacities for that same color. Like if it was disabled, I made it opacity 60% or something like that. And I couldn't figure out any other way of doing this with my CSS variables other than to list out the colors in this strange RGB comma syntax rather than the traditional like hex code or whatever. But then you'll notice that I'm able, on the color edit letter, I'm able to use that orange 2 with 100% opacity, and then I'm able to use the same orange 2 lines down, but with an 80% opacity. It works, but again, there's probably way better ways of doing that. And if any of you know that, please come up and tell me. Let's talk about layout. Confession. I'm terrible at figuring out things like responsive layout. I've tried many times to figure out how do I decide at different screen sizes and orientations what should be showing and what should be not. And honestly, I'm quite annoyed by those, because I'll use an app on my phone, or I'll use an app on a tablet or on a computer, and when I can't find something in one particular orientation because they've hid it underneath a menu or something, I get really annoyed by that. So I'm bad at it, and I don't really like it. And so here's my poor man's version of doing responsive layout, is that I just scale the entire interface to the size of the viewport, but in the exact same aspect ratio. So I just scale it up or down and make it fit itself within the aspect ratio and orientation of the screen. And I do that, I'll show you in just a moment, I just do that by calculating the VW and VH units and then making everything a computation off of that. And I've been doing this for years and been telling people, you know, this is probably a dumb idea, but this is the best that I've got in terms of responsive design, and it allows me to get things that at least reasonably somehow work on all these different devices. And I guess nowadays they even have a thing called like fluid design, which is sort of like that, but probably way better than my version. But again, here's how I did it. I just had the VH and VW units, and then everything's a computation off of that. Strange little computations like divided by 7 and multiplied by 13.1. I just fiddled with it until the proportions were correct. And then to make sure that those units are correct and stay correct, I have a tiny bit of JavaScript that just listens for it computes it at load time, and then just listens for changes to the orientation, and it resets those two CSS variables from the JavaScript. It just resets them to the new computation, and then everything just magically recomputes itself. I've had experts tell me that that's probably the least efficient way of doing that, but it's the best that I could figure out as an imposter at CSS. And, you know, if it kills a bit of my frame rate when you orient the screen, you know, that's a trade-off that I've had to make. So I'm an imposter at CSS. Now, the next thing I'm about to tell you, some of you are probably going to disagree with, but it's a straight-up truth that I still consider myself to be an imposter at JavaScript. I don't think there's any experts out there, and I'm certainly not one of them. JavaScript's far too complex. I wrote that series of books because somebody in an interview told me, you don't know a lot of JavaScript, and I was like, yeah, you're probably right. And it turns out they were right, but it was hard to swallow, because I'd already written a book on JavaScript, and I'd already given a bunch of talks, and I had to swallow my pride and realize that I didn't actually know much about the language. And the only difference between you and me is that rather than running away from that or pretending like that wasn't a problem that I could deal with, I just started asking questions of the language. And then I wrote down my questions and the answers that I figured out along the way. That's the whole magic formula behind writing that book series. And again, I'm so thrilled. I thought like a couple of hundred people might read it. And I'm thrilled, and I can't believe how blessed I am that so many people all over the world have benefited from that. But if you want to know the level of skill of my JavaScript, here's some JavaScript I wrote for that game to figure out an algorithm for the relationships in words. Straight up regular functions. There's no fancy TypeScript going on, because I don't even know TypeScript, so I'm not using TypeScript. And I'm using function declarations and the dreaded var keyword and for loops. This is not me dumbing down my JavaScript. This is the level of my JavaScript sophistication. This is it. And it's kind of a low bar. Okay? Speaking of the JavaScript that I've written, in that survey site that I talked about a little while ago, I use like alerts for all of my different like success and error messages. And I was just about to send this out to all of my Kickstarter backers, and I realized it's going to be like really embarrassing. They're all going to dunk on me when they see that I'm using alerts. So I went and Googled and found this like library called Sweet Alert and dropped in the replacement. I commented out all the alerts and put in the Sweet Alert usages to try to make it look a little bit more professional. And then I realized maybe I shouldn't have done that, because if Alert's good enough for Google Calendar developers, then maybe we should be using Alert. All right, in my remaining time, the real reason that I brought you here was to talk about being an imposter at maybe the most important topic, and I've been thrilled that thus far in this conference, I've already seen it mentioned multiple times. How many of you know what this icon means? That's not nearly enough hands. This is the international symbol for accessibility. Okay, and I want to spend the rest of my time talking to you about being an imposter at accessibility, but that not being an excuse for not caring about and doing accessibility to the best that you can. I had a conversation as part of the research for this talk with this fantastic developer named Andreas Lopez. He's an advocate for accessibility issues, particularly in the gaming world. And he graciously sat down and had a call with me several months back. And we got on this Zoom call, and I'll never forget the very first thing, before we had even said our highs and our pleasantries, the very first thing is Andrea said, hey, you know, Kyle, you and I both have the exact same disability. And I was like, I have just met this guy. How does he know that I have a disability? And then he pulled off his glasses, and he said, you and I are both visually disabled, and yet we're fortunate enough that we have an accessibility tool that we get to wear on our faces. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. Because, quite honestly, I've been doing what I think a lot of our industry has been doing, which has been othering people with disabilities. First of all, the word disability is the negative connotation rather than thinking about ability challenges. So from here on out, I'm going to attempt to try to avoid the word disability and try to say more accessibility challenges. But the truth is that every single one of us has an accessibility challenge of some way, shape, or form. Either permanent or temporary or situational, we have those challenges. And some of us are fortunate and blessed enough to have accessibility tools that we can wear on our face to help with that. And others are not so fortunate. And why is it that we think it's okay to other those people? Those people are not us. Those people are not our customers. The truth is that the lady that bought from your website today, who then broke her arm and has her child, her infant child, in her other arm and no longer has the use of her arms and her hands the next day, is still your customer. But you choose to think, oh, they're not my customer, I don't need to worry about them as much. Why is it that we do that? I'm going to come back to that question multiple times. I want to point to the WCAG principles. These have been pointed out before, but I'm going to highlight a few of them. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I think they're being replaced by 3.x soon, but the 2.x is still good, and they're still in play. I strongly encourage you to go and read about these, but I pulled out what I thought was some really interesting points from this. So first of all, the guidelines say that things need to be perceivable, and that's not just our visual sense. We have 4 other senses. Someday, maybe even smell is going to be involved in how we interact with software, but we have hearing and touch and all kinds of we have all these senses, and yet we only think that accessibility has to deal with whether there's a blind user or not, as if visual acuity is a binary, it's one or the other. It's a spectrum of people having more or less visual challenges, but then all of the other senses are exactly the same. We're all exactly in the same boat with that. So when we build software, we actually need to be thinking about all of those different senses and how somebody may rely upon more of one sense versus the other based upon those challenges. We have to design software considering that. These principles also talk about being operable. There's a physical mechanic to interacting with a device and with a piece of software on a device, whether it's your thumbs, whether it's your arms, whether it's legs if you're playing one of those games or things like that. We have our bodies that we have to interact with computing devices to be able to produce things. I mean, maybe someday it'll be entirely in our brain if Elon Musk gets his way. But right now we have to be able to operate these things with our physical bodies, and not everybody has the exact same capabilities with their mechanical operation of their arms and their hands and their feet and things like that. We need to consider those sorts of things. Understandable. Even if we implant things in our brains the way Elon wants to, not everybody has the exact same level of cognition capability. Some people have cognitive challenges where if something is changing too fast or if there's just too much information presented all at once, they get confused. There's people with dyslexia and all sorts of other challenges that are related to our cognition. And I think most of us are just not paying that much attention to it. We just put all the text on the page and put all the fancy animations on there, and we never provide any affordances for a user to say, I need to slow that down or I need to simplify the interface. We should be thinking about these things. My favorite one is the robust, because we think of responsive design as, I'm so privileged that I own both a phone and a tablet and a laptop and maybe a desktop, so I get to decide which of these devices I'm going to use. My teenage self that didn't even own a phone is like, how could you imagine having so many different devices that you get to choose from? But some people don't have that choice. Some people, because of their challenges, are forced to use one particular device and device form factor versus another. And are we even considering the fact that somebody may be using a tablet because that's the only way they can move the tablet to be accessible to them while they're in a wheelchair or something else like that? We haven't even considered these things in most of our software design. Now, I've been hampering on that we should and we need to be doing these things. But I would imagine that many of you are still a bit skeptical. Many of you are probably saying something in your minds like, that's a good, nice to have. I'd love it if my client or my boss or, the project manager would give us the time to do that. But what Kyle doesn't understand is that it's too difficult for us. We are too challenged, too few resources, too fast of a deadlines. We just don't have the time. He just doesn't understand that we're in a special situation where we can't do it. And the truth is, every single one of you is thinking you're in a special situation, which means, guess what? None of you are in a special situation. That's how engineering works. And we also have a whole bunch of people making decisions about this topic that don't have the slightest clue how they ought to be thinking about it. They don't understand the technology and they don't understand the implications of the decisions that get made. So let me pose it to you this way. If you feel like I'm being a bit confrontational about it, I apologize, but that is quite intentional. I want you to feel a little bit uncomfortable. I want to ask you a question. When was the last time any of you went to a boss, a client, a project manager, and said, listen, we need a bit more time and money in the budget because we need to work on our configuration of all of our Docker images, and we need to get our Webpack better configured and have these command line tools and the build process and all of this other stuff, and we need to switch out from React to Preact, and we need to do all these other sorts of things because this is just what we need to be good, efficient developers. Can we have the time to do that? And I'll answer that question for myself, which is none of you have ever had that conversation. Why? Because you don't consider those things to be optional. You consider those things to be required parts of how you do your job. Why is it that the most fundamental of human rights that we could imagine, the right to be able to participate in the same forums as the rest of the world, the largest tent and most accessible mechanism that mankind has ever built, the web, and yet we say, it's fine if people aren't able to access that. It's fine if people aren't able to use that. There's other parts of the web for them. Our system doesn't need to build for that. Why is it that we think that? Why is it that we're making this optional? If you tell me it's too difficult to convince my boss or my client or my project manager to spend time on it, it's because you made it an option. Why didn't you just make the markup accessible before you committed the PR? Why did you say, well, I committed some markup and now I'd like a little bit of time to go back and add it later? As a brilliant speaker said earlier today, later never happens. So often it never happens because so often we've made it optional. We have to flip this around and say, this is just part of how we do our jobs. The web is fundamentally accessible by default, and we choose to make it optional and inaccessible by our irresponsibility. And yes, I am saying you're not doing your jobs properly if you're allowing this to be an optional thing. But you're saying, I'm not an expert in any of this stuff, and it's so complicated, and there's so many tools. Neither am I. I'm the world's foremost imposter on this accessibility thing, but there's one difference between me and you, is that I give a shit. I care. And I did a little bit of Googling. Here's some markup that I did, and it's probably not even very good. But I did a little bit of Googling to figure out this ARIA role or, something that I could put somewhere on, in my markup to try to make that markup a little bit more accessible to a screen reader. And guess what? I did it with these slides. I took an extra hour of time to make sure I had alt text on all the images of these slides because someday somebody somewhere might download a PDF of these slides and not have full visual acuity and might want to be able to read that alt text. And I chose the color contrast. I used this fantastic tool by Leah Veru, contrastratio.com, and I chose a color contrast for these slides that passes the mark of, and I don't even know what that means. I don't know what 4.93 means or what, but green seems good. So I passed these marks because I'm an imposter at this stuff, but I cared. I mentioned this game Wordle. And I love this game, but I also kind of hate something about this game, which is that it's one of the world's most widely played games, millions upon millions of people playing it a day, and it fails the most basic accessibility things like color contrast. And I'm not an expert at this stuff, but I pulled out the codes for their colors and put it into contrast ratio, and it just fails on almost every one. There's only one of them that it passes just barely, which is the green on white. Now, some of you are saying, well, it's this guy Josh Wardle that, made it for his girlfriend, and it wasn't that big of a deal. And some of you have also pointed out that they have a high contrast mode, and this is what high contrast mode looks like. Unfortunately, it's even worse. Like they went backwards. The high contrast mode has less color contrast than the regular mode. What? And you're thinking to yourself, well, this isn't such that big of a... Oh, and also, why aren't these blue? Isn't that how the way the game's played? Like those are supposed to turn blue. I don't understand that. But some of you are saying, listen, it's not such a big deal that the shadow DOM is completely impenetrable to a screen reader because Josh just built this for his girlfriend and he didn't need to worry about that. I'm going out on a limb. I don't know Josh and his girlfriend, but I'm going on a limb to assume that she probably didn't have an accessibility challenge. Otherwise, Josh might have cared a little bit more. But you say, let's go ahead and forgive Josh's decision here. You say, let's forgive Josh's decision because he was building something and then he got paid, he got a big payday, and he sold it off to the New York Times earlier this year. 6-7 months ago, the New York Times bought it. So if that's Josh's excuse, what's the New York Times excuse? They've owned it for 7 months, and they've made it worse, not better. And I apologize if some of you work for New York Times or have friends who do. I know several people that work there. I'm not trying to be offensive, but they have all the money in the world that they need to prioritize this, and they just don't care enough. They put in a high contrast mode that's worse than the regular mode. And they do nothing to worry about the screen readers and the keyboard accessibility and things like that. And I'm going to push back and say, actually, it is Josh's fault. Because the decision he made flows to the decisions that the large companies make. Because Josh didn't say, this is just how we build for the web. It's not optional. This is just part of our craft. This is how we build for the web. And it's why it's still a problem today when you have huge companies that are running it. I'm just about to wrap up, but I got one final thing for you to ponder. There's a lot of excuses for why people don't do accessible software. Some people say, well, we build software that's just, it's impossible to imagine that it would, if you're like building the Photoshop of the web or whatever you like, it's too complicated, it's too difficult to, and I can imagine that probably some of you work in like the gaming industry, and you probably think games, first-person shooters and full live-action games, there's no way that you can imagine making one of those first-person shooters be working on a screen reader with somebody who can't visually see. And it turns out, actually, Andrea said that this industry has quite a bit of affordances for accessibility tools. It's not great, but they've made some effort. The platforms like Microsoft and PlayStation, they've made effort, and good game developers try to use these things. So if even first-person shooter live-action games can care about accessibility, then what excuses do we have left on the web? If they can make those things a little bit more accessible. I'm not talking about becoming an expert. I'm saying as an imposter, can you just do a little bit more than zero? Because a little bit more than zero is infinitely more than zero. Just a little bit more effort can go a long way. So this final thought experiment that I have is a game that I want to exist. It doesn't exist, but I want this to exist. A live-action RPG kind of a game where you select characters based upon their different skills and talents and capabilities. And that should sound like any RPG that you've ever played, except these skills and talents are physical sorts of things, like whether it's a visual challenge or whatever. And here's the real trick. When you play with a character with one of those ability challenges, you actually have to use the accessibility tool to play the game. I think this would change the discussion around accessibility if we made something like that exist. I do not have the requisite skills to bring that about. Some of you in this room probably do, and if any of you in this room care enough, please reach out, because I'd like to get a group together and make something like that exist. Because I think it would change our conversation from this being an optional thing to being a required part of what we do. Even if we're not experts at it, even if we're imposters at it, if we just care enough to do a little bit. So let me close by reintroducing myself. Hi, everyone. I'm Kyle. I'm a professional imposter. And I've been faking it my entire career, trying to figure out how to do things a little bit better and learn things a little bit better. But I haven't been waiting before doing. I've been learning as I go. I hope some of you are maybe challenged to do the same and maybe encouraged. Thanks for listening to my thoughts today.
All right. First of all, thank you, Kyle, for your thought-provoking presentation. So we have only one question, or actually questions are starting to come in, but this question came a little bit early in the presentation, but still, do you think we have to be imposters sometimes just to get ourselves in a position to quote-unquote do so we can quote-unquote learn?
If being an imposter means what I'm suggesting, which is getting out of the way of your brain trying to trick you into believing you don't have skill and just doing with whatever skill you do have, then I 100% am behind. We all need to be a little bit more of an imposter from time to time, and in fact, maybe as a regular part of our job, to push through those barriers and to exceed and to learn things. And if my career has anything to say, it is that I can imposter my way to more understanding of these technology. So I encourage more people to try to look at it that way instead of saying, oh, I haven't mastered this thing, or somebody hasn't written the perfect book on this topic and I haven't read it yet. Why don't you go be that person? Why don't you go imposter your way to the success in a similar way that I've been able to do?
Okay, thank you. Another question. Do you feel that people who focus on doing first and learning, quote-unquote, the right way later, are more likely to know about need for accessible internet right away?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure whether the obvious levels of empathy that are required to approach accessibility as a required part of our job, I'm not sure if that level of empathy automatically comes by somebody being an imposter, but I would say that the reverse is often true, that if all you've been focused on is staying in your own head and doing your own thing in your own little island and wait until it's perfect and then I'm going to put it out into the world, and you haven't gotten any feedback and any opportunity for other people and a more varied audience to see what you've been working on, you will almost certainly not have the right level of empathy. So I would say that it correlates, that the more that you are an others-focused and public and trying to hang it all out there and try to get ideas and get feedback and not be scared that somebody might tell you, like somebody's going to say that my design sucks, and I'm not scared to hear that. But it's also going to allow me to push forward and make something a little bit better tomorrow. And so I think that there's a strong correlation between the two, if it's not necessarily a causation.
Okay, thank you. Another question. What are good examples of accessible web apps that are used globally?
I don't know. I guess I would say, right off the top of my head, a web application that I use literally daily would be the Gmail web application. And I think they've put quite a bit of effort into it. I think we had a talk earlier today from GitHub, and GitHub is a pretty fantastic piece of software. And I've never had any challenges with either of those two pieces of software in any situation that I've been in, whether it was keyboard or related or even low network related. So I would say they're doing a pretty good job with those. But yeah, that's one I'm not super prepared to answer.
Okay, fair enough. So the last question, is imposter equal out of comfort zone?
I think that being willing to tell yourself that the comfort zone that you've convinced yourself that you have is actually the lie, that's probably what being an imposter means. It means just admitting that there is no such thing as that comfort zone where you're an expert in your own little island world and nobody else knows that. That's the lie. And so once you admit that, then you're willing to push things out there. Like the way that I create a new open source project, I've told this to people many times, I will start by putting up a new empty file on GitHub and then just committing lines of code long before I've got any idea on exactly how it's going to be designed or what it's going to be, and I just start putting things up there. And the reason I do that is because I assume that every line of code that I write is the worst possible version of that code, and that the only hope that I have of making it a little better is maybe convincing somebody else to take a look and making a suggestion, pointing out something that I couldn't figure out and helping me make that better. That, to me, is the spirit of us working as, as a big family, if you will, under this tent of the web. And it's why I love open source, because that collaborative aspect is not possible in these other sorts of paradigms. So I think it does mean admitting that that comfort zone is really actually just a lie to yourself, and then being willing to push it out there and say, this doesn't make me feel like less of a person because somebody figured out something that I could have done better. Actually, it's an encouraging and challenging and exciting thing every time I get input from somebody to help me make something better.
Thank you. So I encourage everyone to approach Kyle and continue the discussion, because this is really a thought-provoking presentation. And with that, we will wrap up this session.
So one last note, that do go and sign that professional imposter manifesto. And if you do, I've got stickers with that logo on it. So if you come up and tell me, I'll give you a sticker.
Perfect. Let's hear it for Kyle.